Welcome to the program. I'm Min San-hee with our group of foreign correspondents. It's good to see you all again.
Good to be here. Nice to be back.
Last month, Lee Jae-yong, the vice chairman of Samsung Group, was put behind bars over his alleged role in a corruption scandal that has rocked Korea's political and corporate circles. We have details of this event as well as the reaction from the international media in our first report. On the morning of February 17th, a Seoul court approved the arrest of Samsung Group heir-apparent Lee Jae-yong. He has been accused of paying bribes to President Park Geun-hye and her confidant Choi Soon-sil as part of a massive corruption scandal.
서울 중앙지법으로부터 뇌물 공여 등의 혐의로 이재용 삼성전자 부회장에 대한 구속영장을 발부받았습니다.
이번 일로 저희가 좋은 모습을 목표로 드리자 정말 송구스럽고 죄송하게 생각합니다.
He was arrested on suspicion of bribery, embezzlement, perjury, hiding assets abroad, and concealing illegal gains. News of the vice chairman's arrest made headlines worldwide, with a heavy focus being placed on what impact his absence would have on Samsung as a whole. Reuters speculated that the uncertainty stemming from his absence may lead to big changes at the group. Japanese financial newspaper the Nikkei reported that Samsung lost its biggest decision maker, leaving concerns of stagnation in management. Meanwhile, CNBC said that although the arrest inflicted damage on the conglomerate's reputation, its credit ratings have stayed intact, and that his absence would not impact the company's daily operations. Other media outlets also focused on Samsung being a Chaebol, one of Korea's family-controlled conglomerates. The Associated Press said the arrest will likely shock the business community and bolster claims made by critics of Chaebol groups. And through an article called Money, Power, Family Inside South Korea's Chaebol, the New York Times provided analysis on Chaebols and how they came to power, along with the news of Lee's arrest. The arrest of Samsung's Lee Jae-yong came as a surprise to many in Korea, and it has once again put the country's powerful Chaebol groups under the spotlight. Now, there was much international media attention over Lee's arrest. Was this because it was related to the Choi Soon-sil scandal, Frank? Or was it because he's the heir-apparent of one of the largest business groups in Korea?
I think probably both, and I think it depends on the media. If you look at, an organization like Bloomberg, they're going to cover it from a business angle, whereas other broadcasters like myself are going to cover it in relation to the president, and perhaps a little bit of cross-coverage in terms of its business and political implications.
What was your angle, Elise, when you covered it?
We did the straight story, obviously, just that this was the chairman or the acting head of the world's largest mobile phone maker, getting wrapped up into a scandal that has already gotten the president impeached. And so, as Frank described, it's sort of a dual track, and the significance of Samsung's name globally is well known, and so that is why it carried newsworthiness.
Right. Marcus, you said you covered it for a Danish TV show?
I did, yes. I think in Europe, the arrest also offers sort of an occasion to take a closer look at the business culture of Korea, the role that the conglomerates are playing here. So that's what I looked at when I covered this story. I looked at the role that Samsung plays in South Korean society and the role that the Chaebols play in general.
Right, and we'll get back to that later on in the show. Now, the prosecutors, yes, they call it bribery. They say that much money was funneled to the two entities set up by Choi Soon-sil. Samsung claims the money was a donation requested by President Park Geun-hye, and thus that Samsung itself was a victim. What are your thoughts on this?
So much of law is about intent, right? And so if you can prove intent, then they have a sort of pay-for-play scenario, which is what prosecutors are alleging, right? So if Samsung had any knowledge or any promises in the first place that, you donate this and then you will get the quid pro quo, right? Like you will get this merger's wheels greased, then they have a case, it's proven. What we don't know and what most of the viewing public does not know is what kind of evidence is there to support that claim?
Yes, I agree with Elise here that the real question is, do they have any evidence? I think it's quite obvious that the circumstantial evidence is incredibly strong. I mean, even internal analysis of that merger between Samsung C&T and JL Industries indicated that the National Pension Service would lose $60 million. And then another estimate, outside estimate, suggested that the National Pension Service would lose $300 million. So it's obvious that there were some problems with that. That approval in itself may have been a criminal activity taking place there. It's interesting to see how the prosecution, how their charges have kind of fanned out in different aspects. And this merger really, I believe, is key, but it's going to be hard, I think, really hard, if not impossible, to find direct evidence that Lee Jae-yong made a deal with them directly and have some sound recording or some other documentation of that agreement.
What image does Samsung enjoy abroad? We can start with in Europe.
Well, I think a lot of Europeans know Samsung. A lot of Europeans have Samsung phones or they have Samsung TVs in their homes. I think a growing number of Europeans are aware that Samsung is a South Korean company. Not all Europeans are aware of that. But it's definitely, they might also be aware that it's a very successful company, becoming more so. But I don't think they know a lot about, or I'm pretty sure that very few Europeans know a lot about the leadership of Samsung and the family who's running Samsung. So I think that's why they're also very interested in following this case.
So contrary to concerns here, his arrest will not affect Samsung's brand image overseas, in Europe?
Well, no. I mean, I think if you look at the crisis that Samsung has weathered in the past, you look at the Galaxy Note 7 crisis, that was a huge scandal. Even if Europeans or any other Samsung consumers forgot about that crisis, then every time they went to the airport, they would be reminded that they weren't allowed to bring their Samsung phones on the plane because it might catch fire. But last year, Samsung had a very, very good year. If you ask, there are polls being made both in Europe and in the US where they are asking Samsung buyers if they would buy another Samsung phone after the Galaxy Note 7 incident. And a lot of them are saying yes, they would. So I don't think that that the arrest will have a big influence on Samsung's brand in Europe anyway.
And another thing I'd like to add there is the role of Lee Jae-yong. He's not a front and center CEO in the same mold as Stephen Jobs or Bill Gates. He's a background sort of person that again, people wouldn't identify as being the CEO, whereas Stephen Jobs and Bill Gates, you know exactly what companies they're involved with and who they are. Lee Jae-yong would be, an unknown figure to people in other countries.
Do you think his absence at the company would affect the stability of Samsung itself?
It doesn't seem so, because it's unclear that the titular head of an organization is doing that much day to day. I mean, there's so many department heads. I would reckon that DJ Ko, the man who's running mobile, has a firm command of mobile and what's going on underneath him, and it's not the chairman of the company or the acting chairman that would actually be overseeing day to day anyway. I mean, they spend a lot of time working as essentially diplomats, glad handing the Mark Zuckerbergs and other CEOs of the world and showing up at conventions and big investor meetings just to sort of make sure that the company looks stable, and seems to be on the up and up. I don't think that they tend to run day-to-day operations. And
even, their product line, they're coming up with the Galaxy 8S mobile phone apparently in a few weeks. So it doesn't seem to have really affected the company that seriously in terms of its, future plans.
Right. Do you believe that to a certain extent, Local media coverage of Chaebol-related stories is somewhat biased.
Samsung has a lot of pull when it comes to advertising in newspapers and even being sort of involved in the ownership of newspapers, then you can argue that they aren't being covered rigorously.
I think it's kind of interesting that there is a relationship in terms of family between Samsung and JTBC. And it's very interesting to see how aggressively JTBC has pursued this story. I think really we've seen kind of a bit of a sea change in the behavior of South Korean media here. You saw that a little bit with Park Geun-hye's apologies, where by the third apology, the press was raising their hands and calling questions after, behaving much more assertively than perhaps South Korean media had in the past.
We take some time now to explore the history of Korea's chaebols that played a significant role in building Korea's economy in its initial stages. But at the same time, they've also been accused of triggering social inequalities. Samsung, Hyundai, LG, Lotte, SK, and Hanwha. These are some of Korea's biggest chaebol business conglomerates. The term chaebol comes from the two Chinese characters che, meaning wealth, and pol, meaning clan or faction. Combined, it has come to mean family-controlled business conglomerates in Korea. Chaebols were largely born back in the 1960s when Korea was stepping up industrialization under government-led economic development policies. It's hard to deny that these businesses contributed significantly to Korea's economic development. Founders such as Samsung Group's Lee Byung-chul and Hyundai's Chung Ju-young created many new opportunities with their strong entrepreneurship and appetite for innovation. But over the years, as their scions took the reins, the image of strong chaebols has taken a tumble. A survey carried out by Korea's YTN in December shows that 66% of the public believe chaebols do not benefit their lives nor the Korean economy. Many said their negative views come from the belief that the big business groups contribute to social polarization, government and business collusion, and the demise of mom-and-pop stores, among others. This sentiment has also been reflected in some reports by global media outlets. The Economist points out that many South Koreans are fed up with the impunity of its corporate shift hands in its report about the arrest of Lee Jae-yong. The New York Times said in an article entitled "Samsung as Arrest in South Korea Intensifies Calls for Cleanup" that the power of the chaebol is coming up against rising public anger over the perception of corruption and favoritism. And the Straits Times from Singapore reported that chaebols have seen their reputation dragged through the mud in recent years because of scandals and corruption allegations. Korea's chaebol groups have wielded great influence over the country's economy and society as a whole. People are now looking for a change in their roles and attitude towards society for the better. Were you familiar with the word chaebol prior to coming to Korea, Elise?
I was not.
No. Do you understand the word now, though?
Oh, of course. I mean, I've been here for a couple of years. They are the dominant business structure in this.
Are they similar business structures abroad?
There are similar ones in Japan. So the chaebol is actually, the same characters as Zaibatsu, which is the conglomerate in Japan. So this is actually taking after a Japanese tradition. I think those are the kind of closest parallels, the Toshibas, the Sharps, the Panasonics, the Sonys, and their very central role in the Japanese economic rise. So in a lot of ways, Korea is just, a decade or two behind, or a generation behind Japan in the experience of these multinational conglomerates.
What about in Europe, Marcus?
No, we don't have conglomerates that resemble the conglomerates here in South Korea. In Scandinavia, where I'm from, there's a lot of family-owned businesses. A great deal of the businesses in Scandinavia are family-owned, and some of them are run by third or even fourth generation of the families that founded the companies. But they're usually pretty small, they're mid-sized or even smaller, and they're specialized. They usually just have one sector that they operate in. So it's a different system.
Frank, having been here the longest, what are your personal thoughts about the chaebol management structure or the business entity of chaebols?
Well, I think it's a bit problematic when they they take up such a huge portion of the South Korean economy. Something like Samsung Electronics itself represents 18% of the South Korean economy, almost, I think, a third or something of the market cap. So that's one sort of issue. The other issue is its influence on other companies that are suppliers to Samsung.
What are your thoughts on that, Elise?
The big complaint about Chaebol, the big argument or critic, or what critics say, is essentially that they take up too much space in the economy, in that small and medium-owned enterprises or sized enterprises can't compete. What ends up happening is it stifles innovation, because unless the Chaebol itself is constantly changing and coming up with new ideas and allowing competition within itself, within its own organization, then these small upstarts aren't able to compete against them because they're just too big, and then they have too many ties to other vendors and customers. And what happens is that the economy then suffers overall because there's not enough innovation happening. And South Korea is looking at this problem, and just as I mentioned, in the way that the big conglomerates of Japan are now failing or really struggling, for example, Toshiba. If the Chaebol don't reform themselves, that is likely to happen here in Korea as well. I think that the big Chaebol here realize that, and they've been trying to find all these ways to sort of make themselves more creative and innovative and more Silicon Valley-ish. But the whole beauty of Silicon Valley and the reason why it is Silicon Valley is because people could start companies in garages, right? Or people could start companies in their college dorm rooms and they could compete. You don't see that in East Asia as much, and partly it's because of the structure of these giant conglomerates.
You talked about reforms. Marcus, what could be a big reform that Samsung could implement? I mean, it's a call that the public is making right now after Lee Jae-yong's arrest. There are many calling for reforms of Chaebol's. Right. What would be one way to?
Well, there seems to be a lot of structural problems that you could address. I mean, one would be the leadership that the family has over the conglomerate. Try to limit that in one way or the other, and try to introduce a professional management, of one that wasn't relying on the members of the families.
I think a lot of those laws actually probably exist in South Korea, but they just might not be implemented. This is one of the sort of criticisms that I might have of the Chaebol and of this whole scandal that's unfolding now, is that the rule of law isn't respected as carefully as maybe it could be in South Korea. Instead, you have what would be called the rule of man, in which case it depends who is on trial or who is accused. Will determine the outcome of that trial, as we've seen with the previous, pardons of Lee Gun-hee.
Right. Aside from corruption allegations, Chaebols have seen their reputations fall in light of misbehaving by Chaebol offsprings in public.
해당 사무장이랑 승무원한테 직접 사과하실 생각 있으십니까?
진심으로 사과드리겠습니다. 모든 경영 일선에서 물러날 것입니다. 다른 계획 없습니다.
제가 지인들과 술을 먹는 자리에서 좀 너무 술을 많이 먹은 것 같습니다. 제가 잘못한 거는 당연히 인정을 하고 그 죄에 따른 어떠한 벌도 달게 받도록 하겠습니다.
What do you think is the reason behind these despicable displays of entitlement by Chaebol offspring?
Absolute power corrupts absolutely. I mean, the children of the Chaebol have been, born with a silver or platinum spoon and given the sort of red carpet treatment. I mean, there's another case recently of a drunken brawling Chaebol son who's being, I think, indicted for his behavior. And then you have the whole Chae-shun-chil, Chung-yu-ra aspect of the Park Geun-hye scandal. So it's not something that's going to go away. It's part of that issue of entitlement of the children of the very rich that we see in other countries as well, I think.
Yeah, I think cases like the nut rage incident and other cases where sort of the lifestyles of some of these Chaebol families suddenly become open to the public, and they get they get to see the self-perception of some of these families and the lives they actually lead. I think that's really harmful to the public image of the Chaebols. And I was a little surprised. One of the first stories I did when I came to Korea was about the perception that Koreans had of these families and the role they play in popular culture here. So they're portrayed, or Chaebol-like families are portrayed in TV series and movies, and I was writing a story about that. And I thought that there would be a lot of coverage about these families, you know, in sort of tabloid papers, or because in Europe we're used to having, like in my home country, we have a royal family, and that serves sort of the main focus for tabloid and gossip magazines, and that's what we're always talking about. And I thought that the Chaebol families of South Korea would be a similar sort of aristocracy that a lot of people would be talking about and would be involved in the everyday lives that they were leading, who they were marrying, where they were going on vacation.
And they'd get routinely dragged through the mud like in the tabloids in Europe, but
that doesn't happen. And I was really surprised by how little people know about. I mean, of course, there's a lot of rumors, there's a lot of talk about what these families are doing, but it's just not available to the public. And so when something like the nut rage incident happens, or the divorce that was a public affair, the divorce of J.Y. Lee's sister a few years ago. When that happens, everybody is following that, and it offers a view into the lives that these families lead, and I think that's tremendously harmful to their public image.
Right, they're very private. Do you think Korea still needs Chaebols? They are, like we saw in the report, 66% of Koreans believe that Chaebols do not have a positive impact on the Korean economy. Do we still need them?
Whether Korea needs them or not, one way to answer it is, for now, yes, because they're the backbone of the economy, but whether they should still exist is a different question. And part of the reason they do continue the way they do is not even something that can be changed by structure. It would have to be changed culturally, and cultural change is a lot more difficult than any sort of policy change, because my bird's eye view on Korean society is that parents still raise their children to want to work at Samsung, right? That this is part of this narrowly defined path to success for so many young Koreans, that you want to be a Samsung man, that you want to work at a Chaebol, that society deems Chaebol life successful. And so unless the definition of success changes or widens in this country, then I don't see them going away, at least not as quickly as they would probably need to in order to spur the economic growth that this country is looking for.
It's really difficult. I think also, money talks. There was a recent article that said that the Chaebol pay almost double to its employees than small and medium-sized companies. You're just not going to develop incentives that are going to move people off of wanting to work there. It's really interesting to have, be around some young people. Sometimes I do some university teaching, and there's two sort of very contradictory feelings about Samsung. One is I want to work there. One is I dislike the power that company has, or its misbehavior is reprehensible. But at the same time, I'd really love to work at one of the Chaebol companies.
Right, so today we talked about Lee Jae-yong's arrest and the role of Chaebols in Korean society. How do you assess today's discussion, Marcus?
It was an interesting discussion. I think it's very important to talk about not only the role that the conglomerates have in the South Korean economy and how important they are to the economy here. It's also important to look at the difficulties that they pose for South Korea if the country wants to keep developing its economy and to create innovation. So I think we touched upon that today, and that's important.
Spring is almost here. The weather is getting milder. American Actor and comedian Robin Williams once said, spring is nature's way of saying, let's party. So do take some time to venture outdoors and indulge in nature's latest party of sights, sounds and scents. Thank you for watching.